Picture a single iron pot hanging over a low fire in a one-room English cottage, sometime around the year 1300. It has been there since before dawn. It will still be there at midnight, and it is almost never scraped empty. Whatever is inside it has a name: pottage. That one pot was breakfast, dinner, and supper for an entire family. It cooked on almost no fuel. It needed almost no skill. It wasted almost nothing. And it stayed the everyday staple of ordinary European life for the better part of 1,000 years. Now look at how you eat. The average American family throws away around $1,500 of food a year, bought and never eaten. And more than half the calories in the average American diet, 55% of them, now come from ultra-processed products. We have refrigerators, supermarkets, and a kitchen full of appliances, and we still waste more food and eat worse than a medieval peasant working a single pot over an open fire. They had a food system, we have a food industry, and almost everything the history books tell you about that pot is wrong. It was not joyless grey gruel. It was one of the most efficient, adaptable, and genuinely nourishing food systems ever built. Today we are going to dig it back up and show you exactly how it worked in 4 parts. Part 1. What pottage actually was. Start with the word itself. Pottage comes from the old French potage, which meant very simply that which is put in a pot. The modern English word porridge is a direct descendant of it, and for centuries the two were almost interchangeable. And that origin tells you something the recipe books never say out loud. Pottage was not a dish, it was a method. It was whatever you had on hand, simmered slowly in water or stock until it turned soft, thick, and edible. That method was built around a single object, the cauldron. For a peasant household, the cooking pot was often the most valuable thing they owned. Pots were named in wills and handed down to children because a family might own exactly one. A poor household might have a single pot, one knife, and a few wooden bowls, and that one pot was expected to do everything. There was no oven. There was no second flame. There was the fire and the pot above it, and everything the family ate was cooked in there. Medieval cooks knew 2 broad kinds. Running pottage was the thinner version, closer to a soup, loose enough to drink straight from the bowl. Standing pottage was cooked down much further until it was stiff enough to hold the shape of a spoon pressed into it. Same pot, same method, different amount of patience. But knowing what pottage was does not explain the thing that actually made it work. How did one pot feed a whole family every single day on almost nothing? For that, you have to look at the fire. Part 2. The fire that never went out. Here is where pottage stops being a recipe and becomes a system. The pot was rarely emptied. A medieval household did not cook 3 separate meals a day the way we do now. The fire itself was too expensive for that. Firewood had to be gathered by hand, it took real labour, and in many regions the right to collect it was controlled by the local lord. Lighting a cooking fire from cold every few hours was a waste no working family could afford. So the fire stayed banked and the pot stayed on it day and night. The pottage inside was topped up, not thrown out. Yesterday's leftovers became the base of today's meal. A few handfuls of grain, some vegetables from the garden, more water, and the pot simply continued. There is an old English nursery rhyme almost everyone has heard without ever thinking about what it actually describes. Peas porridge, hot, peas porridge cold, peas porridge in the pot, 9 days old. That rhyme is a folk memory of this exact practice. Pottage eaten hot, then eaten cold the next day, then kept and reheated again after that. To a modern viewer, food left in a pot for days sounds dangerous, but a pot held at a steady simmer over a banked fire is, in effect, being reboiled every single day, and that constant heat held the worst of the spoilage in check. Far from careless, it was a working preservation method that cost nothing. This is the real genius of pottage. One pot fed a household with almost no waste and almost no effort. It cooked itself while the family worked the fields. It did not need watching. A young child could tend it. The whole system ran on the two things a peasant family had least of: fuel and time, and it spent almost none of either. It is worth holding that next to your own kitchen. By most estimates, somewhere between 30 and 40% of all the food in America is thrown away, much of it still perfectly edible. The medieval cottage, with one pot and one fire, threw away close to nothing, because it could not afford to. That was not virtue, it was design. And the next part of that design was what actually went into the pot. Part 3. What went inside? The foundation was almost always grain or legumes, and usually both. In England, that meant oats, barley, and rye, alongside dried peas and beans. Wheat was the expensive grain, the bread grain, and most peasants ate very little of it. But oats and barley grew willingly in poor soil and cold weather, where wheat would fail, and dried peas and beans stored for months and dropped into the pot whenever they were needed. Peas pottage, dried peas cooked down into a thick, dense paste, was so universal that its name became shorthand for plain, humble, everyday food. On top of the grain went the vegetables, and here the medieval household used a word we have almost entirely lost. They were called worts, or pot herbs. Cabbage, leeks, onions, garlic, kale, and whatever leafy greens the season offered. Most cottages kept a small garden for exactly this. In Old English, that plot was sometimes called a leek tun, literally a leek enclosure, because leeks and onions were the hardiest, most dependable things in it. The garden fed the pot fed the family, a closed local loop running a few steps from the cottage door. Meat was the luxury layer, and for most families not a daily event. The peasant's animal was the pig, and a small piece of salted bacon could be dropped into the pot to give the whole thing fat, salt, and savoury depth without anyone eating a real portion of meat. A single piece of bacon could season a pot for most of a week. Herbs went in freely, and medieval cooks treated their pot herbs as quietly medicinal, food and remedy at the same time. And the recipe was never truly fixed because the seasons would not permit it. Spring leaned on the first young greens, summer on fresh vegetables, autumn on the full harvest, winter on stored grain and dried peas. The method never changed. What you put into it changed with the turning of the calendar. There was even a sweeter member of the family, called frumenti, whole wheat simmered slowly in milk, eaten at every level of society and served beside meat at feasts. Pottage was less a single food than an entire category, and that flexibility is a large part of why it never went out of use. So the pot was cheap, efficient, and endlessly flexible. But cheap and flexible is not the same as good for you. Was pottage actually keeping anyone healthy, or just keeping them full? Part 4. Why it kept you alive. This is the part the gruel myth gets most badly wrong. Pottage was not starvation food. For a hard-working population with no refrigeration, no supplements, and no safety net of any kind, it came remarkably close to nutritionally ideal, and modern science can now explain why. Start with the grain and legume base. Grains and legumes eaten together supply a fuller, more usable set of the proteins the human body requires than either of them provides alone. Modern nutritional science has a name for this. It is called protein complementarity, and it was only properly understood in the last few decades. A medieval peasant eating barley and peas out of the same pot was assembling a genuinely workable protein source from the two cheapest ingredients available, without the faintest idea of the chemistry. They were centuries ahead of the science, entirely by accident. Now add the warts. Cabbage, leeks and leafy greens carry real vitamins and minerals, and because pottage was simmered slowly in a more or less closed pot, much of what cooked out of those vegetables stayed in the liquid instead of being lost. Nobody poured the goodness down a drain. The broth was the meal. The long, slow cooking did one more important thing. It broke tough, fibrous, hard-to-digest ingredients down into a form the body could actually absorb, unlocking calories and nutrients that would otherwise have passed straight through. For people doing hard physical labour from dawn to dusk, that mattered. Nothing edible was wasted, and nothing nourishing was left locked inside an ingredient the body could not open. Historians describe the medieval working diet as standing on 3 legs: pottage, bread, and ale. The bread delivered dense calories. The ale, weak and far safer to drink than much of the available water, delivered still more. And the pottage delivered the vegetables, the fibre, the protein, and the heat. Pull pottage out of that arrangement, and the whole medieval diet falls down. And here the comparison turns uncomfortable. Roughly 94% of Americans fail to eat the fibre that health authorities recommend, and the average adult gets only about half of it. A peasant eating barley, peas, and warts out of that pot was getting more fibre and more whole food nutrition in a single bowl than most modern eaters manage in a day, with a supermarket on every corner. The pottage system was not behind us. In some ways, it is still ahead of us. But who was actually eating it? The answer is not who you would expect. Pottage was not only the food of the poor, it was eaten by everyone all the way up. We have the cookbooks to prove it. The Form of Curie is a recipe collection compiled around the year 1390 by the master cooks of King Richard II of England. It is one of the most important surviving food documents of the entire medieval period, and it is full of pottage. Across the Channel, a French household manual now known as Le Ménagier de Paris, written in the early 1390s, did very much the same. Neither of these books was written for peasants. They were written for wealthy, noble and royal kitchens, and those kitchens were producing pottage constantly. The difference was never the method. It was only the budget. A peasant's pottage was grain, warts, and a little bacon. A lord's pottage was built on exactly the same principle, then loaded with everything money could reach. Almond milk in place of plain water, real meat, sometimes several kinds in a single pot. Saffron to stain the whole thing a brilliant gold. Imported pepper, ginger, and cloves. Wealthy households cooked elaborate, brightly coloured, heavily spiced pottages, gave them names of their own, and served them as a deliberate display of status. A bowl of pottage could be a humble survival meal or a piece of theatre, depending entirely on whose fire it came off. So pottage was not the bottom rung of the medieval food ladder. It was the entire ladder, running without a break from the poorest cottage fire to the king's own table. A food that flexible, eaten that widely, for that long, does not survive by accident. And it did survive, for an astonishingly long time, the everyday staple of ordinary European life for the better part of 1,000 years. Once you can see how the system actually worked, the reason is no mystery at all. Pottage solved nearly every constraint a pre-industrial household faced, and it solved them all at the same time. It needed only one pot and one fire, so it cost almost nothing in equipment or fuel. It cooked unattended, so it cost almost nothing in labour. It accepted whatever ingredients were on hand, so it did not fail when a particular crop did. It consumed leftovers instead of wasting them. It turned cheap grain and a plot of garden vegetables into a meal that genuinely nourished the people eating it. And it did all of this with no oven, no refrigeration, no training, and no written recipe to follow. Nobody had to be taught pottage. You were born into it. That is what a real food system looks like. a flexible, forgiving method that bends around scarcity instead of snapping under it. Strip out the modern kitchen, and most of us could not feed a family for a week. A medieval household did it for a lifetime with one pot. Which raises an obvious question. If the system was that good, could you actually run it yourself? You can, and it is genuinely simple, because simplicity was the entire point. Start with your base. Take a grain, a legume, or both together. Pearl barley and dried split peas are the most authentic choices and the easiest to find. Around a cup of them, combined, will build a solid pot. Rinse them and add them to a heavy pot with plenty of water, or a light stock if you want more depth. Next come your pot herbs. Chop an onion, a leek, a couple of cloves of garlic, and a generous quantity of cabbage or kale. Beyond that, use whatever hardy vegetables you actually have. Carrots and root vegetables belong here too. Authentic pottage followed the season, so use what is genuinely around you. For the savoury layer, add a piece of bacon or a ham hock. This is the medieval move. You are not adding meat as a portion to be eaten. You are adding it as a seasoning for fat, salt and depth across the whole pot. To keep it meat-free, a spoonful of butter and a confident hand with the salt will carry it. Then comes the only real instruction. Simmer it low and simmer it long. An hour at the absolute minimum, 2 or 3 is better. The barley and the peas should slowly collapse. The vegetables should go completely soft, and the whole pot should thicken on its own. Stir it now and then so the bottom does not catch and burn. Season it with salt and whatever herbs you like. For running pottage, stop while it is still loose enough to drink from the bowl. For standing pottage, keep going until a spoon will stand upright in it without help. Eat it with bread. And if there is any left in the pot, do exactly what they did for 1,000 years. Keep it and let it start tomorrow's pot. If this was worth your time, subscribe to Medieval Way. Every week we dig up the practical knowledge that kept people alive long before the modern world built its safety net. And tell us below, what surprised you most about pottage? That a king ate the same dish as a peasant, that one pot ran untouched for 9 days, or that it could outfeed a modern kitchen? Until next time, stay curious.